So here we are at the Highcross shopping centre with the digital beacons in the background, and I'm joined by David Penman on my left. Morning, David.
Good morning.
And John Dilley on my right. Morning.
Morning.
Well, thanks very much for joining us. Obviously, we just had the 2-minute silence here as well, and been talking on BBC Radio Leicester. So maybe just tell us a little bit about the projects that you run. John, start with your one, please.
Well, I'm a former editor of the Market Harborough Mail, and what I'm doing is looking at the archives of the Mail from 100 years ago, which is the Market Harborough Advertiser, and following in a real-time blog what happened, how the war was covered each week. Started in June 1914 and obviously going to go through until November 1918.
And David, your project, is it kind of a similar thing as well?
Well, very similar. Like John, I'm a former newspaper editor and journalism lecturer at Montfort University, and my paper, our local paper, is the Ashbourne Telegraph in Derbyshire, and we're doing a very similar sort of real-time blog. Each week we're producing a sort of 1,000-word review of the paper, but looking particularly at how the conflict was reported back 100 years ago.
So John, you were saying earlier at BBC Radio Leicester, I think we were talking to Jim Davis, you were saying about how local newspapers covered the conflict very differently from the national newspapers.
That's right. The national newspapers were very much restricted by the Defence of the Realm Act, DORA, and the censorship laws. And although those laws still applied to local newspapers, they weren't enforced. And so we see a remarkable insight into how young men kind of lived and suffered, laughed, loved their way through the conflict over in France in particular, but around the world as well, because obviously it was kind of that First World War. What we've discovered, kind of two main things, really, as I say, the amount of information, kind of the intimate information that was provided, but also the eloquence of those young men, kind of common soldiers. The way that they wrote was quite amazing, and kind of very eloquent, easily a match of the great war poets and even our contemporary novelists and filmmakers.
Now, David, you were saying something quite interesting about the paper, the amount of paper shortage and the size of the newspaper, and I suppose people don't really think about the fact that the newspaper industry was affected by paper shortages and stuff.
Well, no, that's right. In 1914, the Ashbourne Telegraph was 8 pages for a penny. Shortly after the start of the war, it was reduced to 6 pages for a penny, and the editor was actually accused of profiteering. But as the U-boats started sinking the shipping and the supplies of newsprint dried up, by the end of 1916, the Ashbourne Telegraph was down to 4 pages, and as a result of that, because the commercial imperative was still there, but actually the amount of news was in severe decline.